In this treaty, we seek to establish freedom from aggression and from the use of force in the North Atlantic community. This is the area which has been at the heart of the last two world conflicts. To protect this area against war will be a long step toward permanent peace in the whole world.
From Mons and Brussels, Belgium, this is An Enduring Alliance, a podcast reflecting on the 70-year history of NATO and its oldest military headquarters, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe.
Welcome back to An Enduring Alliance, our podcast series on the history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and its oldest military headquarters, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE. Your hosts for today will be myself, Dr. Stella Adolf, the Chief Historical Advisor at SHAPE.
I'm Dr. Linda Risso. I'm a history consultant at SHAPE.
And I am U.S. Army Master Sergeant Alex Burnett, a SHAPE Media Operations non-commissioned officer. Today, we will speak about the one and only time in which NATO invoked Article 5 and activated the collective defense mechanism enshrined in its founding treaty. This happened in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States.
Contrary to what the signatories of the Washington Treaty might have expected in 1949, the alliance actually triggered Article 5 not to protect a European ally, but to respond to an attack against the United States.
In this episode, we will explain the significance of this decision. We will look at what NATO did to support the United States in the days and weeks that followed the attacks. In the next episode, we will speak more in detail about NATO's fight against international terrorism and its engagement in Afghanistan.
Miles and miles of sunshine. Miles Davis. We're going to put Miles out there today. Nice as it could be across the Northeast. Rough seas still from the chop from that hurricane, but other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country.
In the early hours of 9/11, 4 coordinated attacks hit the United States in what remains the deadliest attack on a NATO ally.
That morning, 4 passenger airliners were hijacked by 19 members of Al-Qaeda, an international network of Islamic terrorists. 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center towers in Manhattan, New York. And I actually remember when this happened. I was in high school and I was actually going to German class, and I thought on TV there was some bad movie playing, and it ended up being a terrorist attack on the United States.
In less than 2 hours, both towers collapsed. This caused partial or complete destruction of other buildings in the World Trade Center complex and extensive damage in the surrounding area.
A 3rd plane crashed in the Pentagon, home of the U.S. Department of Defense in Virginia. It caused the structural collapse of a part of the building.
A 4th plane was hijacked, but the passengers fought back against the hijackers, and it ended up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania.
An airplane crashing into the side of the World Trade Center.
It shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty.
These attacks killed almost 3,000 people and injured more than 6,000. They caused an excess of $10 billion in infrastructure and property damages.
In the following years, hundreds of people died of respiratory diseases associated with the fine dust released after the collapse of the towers.
The 9/11 attacks are also the single deadliest incident for firefighters and law enforcement deaths. The 9/11 attacks are also the single deadliest incident for firefighters and law enforcement.
This was a shock that hit political leaders and the public across the world. For a moment, everything stopped, and all eyes were on the United States. U.S. President George W. Bush addressed the people of the United States in the aftermath of these attacks.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror.
gravity of the attacks was immediately clear to everybody. News channels across the world broadcast live coverage of appalling scenes of destruction and devastation. There was a clear and undeniable feeling that things would never be the same again.
This is how Lord Robertson, who was NATO's Secretary General at the time, recalls receiving the news.
I heard about the attacks from one of my bodyguards who came into the meeting of the informal lunch of ambassadors that is held every Tuesday. And it's never normally interrupted, so this was something major, but the first word of it seemed to suggest an accident and training planes perhaps hitting a building. It was when the second plane hit that we realised that this was something very special, and we came back to NATO headquarters. So we watched, like the rest of the world, the television pictures of what was happening, especially in New York. And I think it dawned on us, very suddenly, that we were not just observers, we were players, that we were in a military headquarters. We were under the flight path to Brussels airport, and planes were flying across us at that time, and that whatever was going to come out of this was going to involve the alliance as a whole. So we moved from shock and horror and realization into moving very quickly, telling non-essential staff to go home because we didn't know what was happening, phoning Eurocontrol, the air traffic control, which is across the road, to see whether there was any record of any plane leaving and then returning, and then getting down to looking at the political consequences of what we had to do, convening an instant meeting of the ambassadors to express condolences to the Americans, but then meetings of officials to decide whether there was something that we could precisely do in the emergency that was fast developing.
The terrorist attacks were denounced by governments across the world. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 1368 condemned the attacks and pledged to take all necessary steps to combat all forms of terrorism in accordance with its charter.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair said that Britain stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States.
And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
In the evening of September 11th, the North Atlantic Council released a clear and uncompromising message, and I quote, "At this critical moment, the United States can rely on its 18 allies in North America and Europe for assistance and support. NATO solidarity remains the essence of our alliance. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you. Our message to those who perpetrate these unspeakable crimes is equally clear. You will not get away with it."
In the evening of 9/11, Lord Robertson released a personal, sharp message.
At this critical moment, the United States can rely on its 18 allies in North America and Europe for both assistance and for support. NATO solidarity remains the essence of our alliance. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you. Our message to those who perpetrated these unspeakable crimes is equally clear. You will not get away with it.
All NATO leaders expressed their support for the United States. Flags of NATO were lowered at half-mast. A book of condolences was signed by the NATO Secretary General and all NATO ambassadors.
And the following day, on September 12th, the North Atlantic Council had an extraordinary meeting. We've asked Lord Robertson to explain what went on behind closed doors and how the Council reached this decision.
Well, the process of moving to Article 5 was not a simple one. First of all, there was a consciousness that something really serious had happened. The world had changed with this sort of mass terrorist attack. But secondly, we began to think that how could NATO be involved? and the thought came up that Article 5 might be invoked, and a number of people, Edgar Buckley, who was one of the Assistant Secretaries General, went away to draft a statement, because there was going to have to be a statement anyway, but it was slightly more than that. I then did some consultations with the American ambassador, some other ambassadors, as to whether or not this constituted material for Article 5. Now, if you'd had a round table exercise a week before 9/11, and you'd postulated civil airliners crashing into a business building in New York, was that the equivalent of Article 5? People would generally, in an academic atmosphere, have said no, that Article 5 was for a Soviet invasion of Europe. Tanks coming through the Fulda Gap in Germany, and not for a terrorist attack. And yet, America was being attacked from outside. So I spoke to Condoleezza Rice, spoke to Colin Powell, raised the issue with them. They were somewhat surprised, but then, they were enthused by it. We then had to get a statement prepared, and that is in NATO never an easy task. And eventually, we took that statement to the North Atlantic Council at about 3:00 in the afternoon, and I said that they should take it back to capitals and come back at 8:00 with an agreement on it, because basically we hadn't got time for drafting changes. And I spent the rest of that time between 3:00 and what happened to be 9:30, when the final government agreed that they would sign it, talking to foreign ministers, prime ministers, sometimes reassuring, sometimes explaining, sometimes maybe bullying, some of them into accepting this without any amendment, without any change, and basically that day, and at 9:30 we got agreement.
At the end of the meeting, Lord Robertson gave an important press conference in which he invoked Article 5.
On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the Allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all. The commitment to collective self-defence embodied in the Washington Treaty was first entered into in circumstances very different from those that exist now, but it remains no less valid and no less essential today in a world subject to the scourge of international terrorism.
It was a historic moment. For the first time in its history, NATO invoked the self-defense clause. Here is how Lord Robertson records today how he felt at the time as he invoked Article 5 on behalf of the NATO allies.
And I have to say that it was only as I started to read the statement, and I was reading it the other day, that halfway down I realised the real significance of what was happening and what I was actually saying, that this was the first time in NATO's history that we were invoking the self-defence clause. An attack on one country is an attack on all. But I'd just been consumed with the process up until then, and it sort of hit me at that point. And of course, the next day, everyone thought it was the most wonderful idea in the world. The Americans were pleased because it hit them just at the media moment. The doubts were all swept away. The people who'd argued with me on the phone thought it was their idea, and so fine. I have no egotistical ambition there. It was a decision, the right decision at the right time to take. It had a huge psychological effect in America and among the allies that brought them together. And I think it told the terrorists that NATO, was giving them notice. And I think that was one of the most important parts of Article 5. It told our adversaries, both the ones then and any future ones, that NATO was an organisation that could mobilize quickly and make business.
By invoking Article 5, the alliance declared that the attacks on September 11th were an attack against all of its members. This, however, does not mean that all the nations went to war right away. At this point, support mainly took the form of opening national airspace, offering logistical support, and intelligence sharing.
The invocation of Article 5 after 9/11 showed that the bond between Europe and North America was as strong as it had been during the Cold War.
The discussions that took place in the days that followed the attacks also showed that NATO remained the preeminent and unrivaled forum for preserving the security of all its members.
Yes, NATO was the first and most important place in which members discussed their security and coordinated their response.
It is important to remember that NATO also acted as a forum to build support beyond the alliance itself. On September 12th, the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, which included Russia, met and pledged, and I quote, to undertake all efforts to combat the scourge of terrorism. We stand united in our belief that the ideals of partnership and cooperation will prevail.
Later that day, again, there was an extraordinary session of the NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council. In their final communique, we can read, NATO and Russia are united in their resolve not to let those responsible for such an inhuman act go unpunished. The next voice you're going to hear is that of Michael Rula, who has appeared in previous episodes, and he explains discussions that took place at NATO headquarters during this time.
On that same evening, we got together, about 10 people in the international staff, and pondering the options. What are we going to do now? And most people in the room said, let's go for Article 5. Let's invoke, for the first time in NATO's history, the collective defense obligation of the Washington Treaty. A few were more skeptical because they said whatever's going to happen now will be an American solo act, because this is a very American thing now, because they were attacked. So let's be cautious. At the end of the day, the Article 5 invocation group won the argument because it was the strongest signal that one could send across the Atlantic. And it had some, I think, major effects. First, it was invoked in a non-Russian environment. It was not a Russian attack, what we've always thought would be the only trigger for an Article 5. So that was a very interesting change, and I think it was a harbinger of more to come. And second, I think in the evolution of things, when we went to Afghanistan, we basically overcame what we sometimes call NATO's out-of-area syndrome for good. In other words, NATO was no longer a Eurocentric organization. We would go from now on where the threats are. And that, I think, was also implicit in the invocation of Article 5. No matter where the threat comes from, NATO needs to be prepared to defend. So Article 5 on that evening, this discussion of that evening became kind of a defining moment, and I was very happy to have been part of this discussion.
At the time, the United States asked for a range of measures which included enhanced intelligence support, blanket overflight rights for U.S. and other allied aircraft, and access to ports and airfields.
This was quickly granted. NATO, primarily European forces, were rapidly deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans to relieve American forces engaged in NATO missions there.
7 NATO airborne early warning aircraft, AWACS, were immediately moved from their base in Europe across the Atlantic to patrol U.S. airspace. They replaced U.S. aircraft, so they could be deployed elsewhere.
Operation Eagle Assist ran between October 2001 and May 2002. In total, more than 800 crew members from 13 NATO members executed 360 operational sorties. That totaled nearly 4,300 flight hours.
This was NATO's first deployment in the defense of one of its member countries.
These were concrete demonstrations of Allied solidarity in a time of need.
NATO also made a vital contribution in the building of the coalition that supported the United States in its fight against international terrorism.
Since the end of the Cold War, NATO had been building partnerships with Central Asian nations. These countries opened their airspace and bases in order to facilitate effective operations in Afghanistan.
The United States recognized the support of its allies. In a joint press conference with Lord Robertson in the White House Rose Garden on October 10th, President Bush said, and I quote, "This has never happened before that NATO has come to help defend our country. But it happened in this time of need, and for that, we are grateful." Once again, here's Michael Rula on the significance of invoking Article 5 and on the solidarity showed by the alliance.
Well, the number one question was, so what is NATO going to do? I mean, declaring something is one thing, but you need to back up your invocation of Article 5 with concrete measures. Now, there are concrete measures associated with Article 5, like giving the U.S. blanket overflight rights or enhancing the security for American installations in Europe, things like that. This was kind of an automatism. But of course, the bigger question was, once we find out who the perpetrators are, what are we going to do collectively about them? And you will recall it took 2 years before NATO finally took over the command of ISAF in Afghanistan, the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. So there was a considerable gap between Article 5 and then going after the perpetrators, let's say, in a NATO framework. And this showed that it was not so easy for NATO at that time to deliver on the Article 5 promise, because NATO was not prepared for this type of mission. And the U.S. initially built a different coalition to fight the Al-Qaeda and its associates. And for a while, therefore, it looked like NATO was out of the game. It had declared Article 5, but not much had happened. That was remedied over time by NATO adjusting to this new environment and finally taking over the command of ISAF. But it took a while, and I think that was a problem we foresaw from the very beginning, that some people would say, well, you've declared Article 5, then what? I think the significance lies on various levels. The first one was indeed that Article 5 applies to the United States as much as it applies to the Europeans. And many Europeans never thought about this because they thought the only scenario that would ever occur or could ever occur would be a Russian attack or Soviet attack or Warsaw Pact attack on the West, on the Western Europe. So that changed radically. In that sense, it also opened the window, I think, for NATO to better understand the forces of globalization, because it was the wake-up call of globalization, when you think of how this attack was planned, where it was planned, who planned it, how it came about. And to use airplanes and turn them into weapons of mass destruction. This was something completely unthinkable until then, but it suddenly was there. So I think for NATO, it ignited a learning process, and suddenly globalization was not just a term you used in speeches. You saw it right there unfolding, the dark side of globalization. Yeah. And I think that was a huge thing. The second thing was, as I said earlier, it was geography. Until then, we always assumed that NATO was there for Europe. We accepted that NATO had expanded some of its reach in the Balkans, but we did not at that time think of NATO as a more global actor. And this, of course, fell by the wayside the moment we decided we go to Afghanistan, because that's where the problem comes from, and we should tackle it at the source. And when we said in some communiques after 9/11 that NATO must be capable, whenever and wherever a threat occurs, to meet that threat, I think this was a breakthrough of sorts. It was the adjustment of NATO to the globalization age, and therefore I think it was a long-term adjustment of the alliance that people may not have overseen on September 11, where people were much more focused on legal issues like, is a terrorist attack an armed attack? What if that terrorist attack had come from within the United States? Does it then still count as an armed attack? These sort of lawyer questions. But it took, in the end, the Council only 6 hours to decide to invoke Article 5. So I think this shows there was a very strong, lawyers aside, there was a very strong feeling we just got to go through with this.
The decision of invoking Article 5 brought help and support to the United States in the weeks and months after the attacks. It also played a role in the long fight against international terrorism.
Next time, we will discuss how in early October 2001, the US and Britain started their military engagement in Afghanistan. They were soon joined by additional allied nations.
The alliance has been present in Afghanistan ever since, initially in a fighting role against the Taliban, and today to support democratic institutions and to rebuild the country. But more on this next time.
As always, we'd like to thank all of our guests for being on this episode and give a special shout out to Mass Communication Specialist Brett Dodge for being our wonderful producer. Also, thanks go to Paul Magus and the NATO Public Diplomacy Division for opening their recording studio to us and making this all possible. Please visit our website for more information on our guests and for a list of sources. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time.